The following is a work of critical analysis. It is not intended as a work of piracy, and it is covered under fair use as transformative and possibly hypercritical. The main thing I've learned as I've gotten older and interacting with the anime fan base on a larger and larger scale through conventions and online is that not everyone enjoys a piece of media for the same reason that someone else would enjoy a piece of media. For additional context about this idea, I'd recommend a piece by Vice Gaming editor Austin Walker on why he enjoyed Dragon Ball Z as a child, and also a piece by Film Crit Hulk talking about the four layers or levels of media criticism. I'll put those links down in the description below. I first encountered Sailor Moon when it was airing on Toonami after school. Being all of 11 or 12 years old, I really didn't have the critical foundation to think about why I truly enjoyed this series. So I didn't quite ask that question until my junior and senior years of college when I rewatched all 200 episodes of the show. Even then, I required a little more context. It took me a number of years of watching additional anime series that are somewhat related to find out what specifically it was about Sailor Moon that I really did enjoy as a child and still enjoyed as a 22, 23-year-old adult. Even with that context, it took me a little while to really figure out what exactly it was behind my enjoyment of this one franchise. But I like to think that I satisfactorily answered that question, at least for myself. If you're interested as to what the answer is and you haven't seen it already, I gave a presentation at Anime Boston this year, and I recorded that presentation. It's up on my channel on YouTube. I'll put a link in the bottom again. And that brings us to Sailor Moon Crystal. Now, what I'd like to do is go through both the original series and some examples from Sailor Moon Crystal and point out just what reasons a person would have for being a fan of the original series and why Sailor Moon Crystal fulfilled almost none of those reasons when it remade the series. Kind of the first and biggest one that usually comes up is the animation quality for Sailor Moon Crystal. Now, I have a hard time believing that anybody really got into the original Sailor Moon because of the animation quality. While there were certainly some great episodes, like this one from Sailor Moon S, the animation in the original series isn't spectacular a lot of the time. It's more serviceable. The characters will go off model for some things, there'll be cute little jokes, and the directors aren't afraid to use that leeway to really explore the emotions. Couple that with the fact that there were a million lead animators and animation directors over the course of the 200 episodes, and it's really not a series that was prominent for its art. Sailor Moon Crystal, however, was a series that was notable for its art, except in the other way. Toei Animation was once again responsible for the production of Sailor Moon Crystal, and we have evidence from a Tumblr blogger who works for Toei in the Philippines stating that much of the series was a rushed job with no effort or money put into it. But really, none of us should be surprised about that. Why would Toei, already filled to the brim with more profitable and relevant series, take on a direct competitor to Precure and put a lot of effort, or any effort at all, into making that series good? In retrospect, it really does seem absurd. That said, the blowback for the terrible art was so bad that Season 3 brought a number of different changes. I haven't noticed really any of the incomplete, hasty, eyes melting off the faces type things in Season 3, and that's probably for the best. That said, the art is not suddenly good in Season 3. There's still very little animation on the screen, and at best it's only up to the level of the original series, serviceable. All of that is to say, there's not really much of an argument to be had saying you liked Sailor Moon for the art. What I think a lot of people confuse that with is the aesthetic. which is certainly very pronounced even in the manga, and its own unique thing. Seeing girls with such radiant beauty and the long limbs and the smooth actions, that's something I can completely understand enjoying and not seeing anywhere else, certainly in American cartoons in the late 90s. I once spoke on Skype with the creator of Sailor Moon Sacrifice, a fan project that does a fantastic job of recapturing the aesthetic of Sailor Moon, transforming that and adding a little bit more darker tone to it. She talks about how each frame in her work is produced like a painting, a conglomeration. She talked about using art from other shows that had a similar aesthetic, such as Cutie Honey. What's more, she talked about how rare that aesthetic was back in the time frame when we were young and impressionable and looking for something that wasn't classic Nicktoons or Disney princesses. And I think this aesthetic is more or less recaptured within Sailor Moon Crystal. It's certainly present in the manga, and you can see it mostly throughout seasons 1 and 2, but especially in seasons 3. There is something to be said here about the changing styles of the anime industry, and how Sailor Moon Crystal does not, even though it looks like Sailor Moon, does not look like 90s anime, as it shouldn't. That is to say, if the reason that you or anyone else enjoyed the original Sailor Moon was for that aesthetic of the skinny, long-legged girls with their color-coded outfits and their different planetary symbols on their foreheads, then yeah, I could understand why Sailor Moon Crystal might provide that same type of thing. And I think this is what Taguchi really understood to be one of the main components of Sailor Moon. To me, though, that seems astoundingly superficial, and it has been, in the years since, replicated by any number of magical girl shows, many of which have done as good or a better job at it and had other qualities that Sailor Moon Crystal lacks. While we're here, I want to talk about a tangential feeling that I think is relevant to Sailor Moon, and especially in the Western fandom. That would be the idea that Sailor Moon Crystal holds value purely for the nostalgia factor. That we as Sailor Moon fans didn't receive anything, especially in the West, not having Sailor Stars dubbed, until the announcement of this in 2012. And it's certainly valid in some regard. If somebody comes up to you and says, there's going to be more of your favorite thing, then of course you're going to react like that. I know I did. I have a reaction of myself on the day that Sailor Moon Crystal was announced back in 2012. How I literally cried at work. I couldn't imagine something like that happening, and then it did. And I wrote that simple fact, the fact that there's more Sailor Moon, new Sailor Moon, all the way into episode 1 and the first few episodes beyond. Just the fact that they were reanimating it was enough. And I think that emotion wore off for each of us at different times when we finally realized that we had to look at what we wanted from Sailor Moon Crystal, or why did we want more Sailor Moon. Somewhere along the line, each of us kind of asked that, and I think it's finally to the point where we can honestly talk about this. Nobody is still giddy from the fact that there's more Sailor Moon coming out. Or perhaps I should say, I find it very hard to believe anyone is still caught up on the nostalgia trip and that it's still overriding their critical sensibilities at this point, some 3-4 years later. This is also a good time to bring up the idea of an adaptation, or the fact that Sailor Moon Crystal hews very closely to the original manga. I think I can understand a position where someone would very much enjoy the Sailor Moon manga and then appreciate Crystal for being a direct correlation to that. However, I would ask that person why they appreciated the Sailor Moon manga in the first place. I'm very, very confident that would have fall back on the aesthetic point that we already touched upon. If not, I'd be happy to entertain other ideas. And we'll probably talk about a few of them in the following points. The biggest problem I have with leaning on the original manga being the reason for someone liking Sailor Moon, is that the original manga is simply not good storytelling. It's a poor narrative. And the primary reason for that is that it's simply surface level. There are no themes or anything deeper about the characters, only a hint of what could possibly be. We'll talk more about the inadequacies of the original content of the Sailor Moon manga when we talk about some other things that the original series did well. But right now I do want to keep the focus on the different reasons why someone would enjoy Sailor Moon. I think we also have to talk about the superhero aspect to everything, how in much the same way as Western superheroes, there's this idea of being larger than life, of having action and adventure, and how easy it is to be a young child and aspire to something like that. Sailor Moon justifiably gets a lot of credit in this regard for being the first female-focused superhero setup that was available in the West. And I've read a piece by the new voice actress for the role of Makoto in the redub of Sailor Moon, detailing exactly what that meant for a young girl growing up in that time period. Once again, I'll provide a link to that down below. I very much enjoy this reading of the show, even though it's completely foreign to me and I had no connection to any of these characters as aspirational nor liberating figures. That is, I didn't have any gender roles that needed to be torn down. But I think society as a whole benefited from it. I suppose this reading of the show is valid for Sailor Moon Crystal again, but we have to take into account the fact that it's now 20 years later, and these ideas that were extremely progressive on children's television in the late 90s are now commonplace and in your Disney movies, and somewhat less shocking. So if anyone is still holding on to Sailor Moon Crystal as trailblazing or earth-shattering or shaking up the status quo in any way, I think you need to look back on that as nostalgia and look towards something like a Steven Universe that's doing a little bit more in that regard now. All of the previous topics were sort of the surface level, as I would deem it, mostly dwelling in the first or second tiers of the Film Crit Hulk's 4 levels. Amanda Miller's piece on Makoto provides an easy segue for us to talk about the next reason somebody might have enjoyed Sailor Moon Classic. The characters were people. Not only do they have their desires and their fears and their interactions between each other that are all based on their characterization and actually what a person in those circumstances and situations would think, but the real magic is how that's conveyed to the viewer, or in the case of Sailor Moon Crystal, how that isn't conveyed. Now, I could literally pull out 100,000 examples of this throughout the course of the 200 episodes of the original Sailor Moon series, but I like to focus on the really small moments because that gives you a sense of the attention to detail of the creators of the work. Since I was just rewatching Sailor Moon R with a friend, I noticed this one particular scene in episode 57 that I thought really stood out. Or rather, it didn't stand out at all. Here.
何だったんだ今の。こちらアミ、ガーディアンが現れたわ。それ本当？アミちゃん。どこにさ？私の通っている塾。でももう北西の方へ飛び去ったわ。わかったわ。すぐに合流しましょう。さあ行くよ、レイちゃん。へえ、これから面白くなるのに。ほら、早く出動しなさい。わかったわよ。アランそっくり。みんながもう急いで。
This gives us a perfect example of one way to enjoy Sailor Moon, the fact that the characters are fully fleshed out. With no effort required on the viewer's part, you honestly believe these are the actions of teenage girls. First, that 3 of them go to the movies together, but also that they're different in the ways that they approach their responsibilities. Makoto is always serious and not afraid to tell Rei what they need to do. Rei is invested in the love story, but she understands their responsibility. And Minako's caught off guard by someone who looks like her lost love. And Amy, true to form, isn't even at the movies, but instead studying at cram school. So in this one scene, even though it's furthering the plot of the episode, the creators were still able to infuse naturally and organically the type of people that these girls are while they're not sailor soldiers. And this is exactly what's missing from Sailor Moon Crystal. My least favorite and most hilarious example of which would have to be the two-sentence introductions that Usagi gives everybody on the first episode of Season 3. That's how Sailor Moon Crystal treats its characters, other than Usagi and maybe Mamoru. Past their introductory episodes, and a few moments later in Season 3 when people realized that was actually desirable to have this, there's nothing building the characters into believable people. They're far too often grouped as the inner senshi and sent off to die like the Z Warriors as Goku fights Vegeta. Do you remember the time when Usagi flew off to fight and Rei jumps over the table and tries to grab her? Do you remember the time when Amy was having love problems near the end of Season 1 and it was Makoto in her corner cheering her on, telling her to go for it? Do you remember in the first arc of Sailor Stars when Usagi's brainwashed and she finds Makoto's rose earring on the ground and she remembers? Do you remember the time in Sailor Moon S when Minako actually wanted to have her pure heart stolen, so she started doing good deeds and giving blood? None of this can or does happen in Sailor Moon Crystal. Stuff like this is lost. The series has no room to breathe, and it moves on from abstract plot power to abstract plot power with not a breath in between. I think it should go without saying, then, that the same exact thing happens for the villains in the show. There's a very real humanity in the Spectre Sisters, or Mimette, that gives nuance to the actions that are being taken, but also allows the show to explore themes it would otherwise be unable to by simply painting these random characters as bad guys. To put it this way, the overarching villains, the Pharaoh 90s and the Queen Metalias in the original series, are kept completely off screen with little interaction with anyone. The generals, the Zoisites of the original series, have a lot of subtlety to them. You have the Nephrite storyline, you have the Spectre Sisters, you have all of them either accepting or rejecting Sailor Moon's philosophy. In Sailor Moon Crystal, they're nothing but the monster of the day. They're just blanketly evil with no nuance. So anything they say doesn't really build them up as human, it only is plot babble. So this leads into the final and most egregious portion of Sailor Moon Crystal's failure. If you watch shows for themes or messages or explorations about what's important and relevant in life, Sailor Moon Crystal has nothing, whereas the original Sailor Moon series had so much to offer. For example, even in the first season of Sailor Moon Classic, you have the idea that people shouldn't be judged based on their appearances and what they might initially seem, and how that's in Sailor Moon Crystal as well, obviously, but you have that manifested further with Naru and her relationship with Nephrite, and how that then becomes the concept that Sailor Moon takes forward into the climax. I wrote a very long post about this, and you can go read it. I'll put it in the link below. So in the manga and the Sailor Moon Crystal re-envisioning of the show, there's not enough of the slice of life kind of small time and not enough execution on what little small moments there are to make the friendship and the valuing your other characters feel meaningful. But there's also not the whole theme of love conquering all. It's just sort of the abstract beams flying at each other. And the idea that everybody can be redeemed and that violence and external power is never the final trump card. It actually doesn't avail you the day. None of that is present in the manga. None of that's present in Sailor Moon Crystal. And while some of the things like Mamoru's relationship with Usagi and Setsuna's whole backstory maybe get a little more screen time and are a bit better, Sailor Moon Crystal is fundamentally the show without the show's heart. And listen, I could go on for hours, down to minutia about Sailor Moon Crystal. Things like the bad writing, having the characters exposit how they feel, putting front and center these nameless black blobs that look like Abathur from StarCraft II's Zerg campaign, spending all the money getting some of the best voice actors in the business, and then not having anything for them to say. But I really want to keep this grounded in why someone would like the original Sailor Moon series and why Crystal doesn't provide that to most everyone. So if you like the action, watch Lyrical Nanoha. If you like the concept, watch Pretty Cure. Heartcatch in particular is one of my favorites. If you like badass women challenging gender roles and doing cool things, I'd recommend Revolutionary Girl Utena. If you like the challenge of appreciating characters for who they really are, I'd sincerely recommend The Melancholy of Haruhi Suzumiya. If you like the comedy and that hot 90s art, Tenchi Muyo is something you should look into. If you like the whole idea of destiny and aspiring to be something better than you are and being limited by that, I would recommend Penguin Drum and Princess Tutu, which both deal in that same area. And if you want a deeper exploration of what it means to have that love and justice triumph, what miracles and magic existing really does for the narrative, there's no better show for any Sailor Moon fan to watch than Puella Magi Madoka Magica. And if you really do want more Sailor Moon, I'd really encourage you to look at all the fan content that's been created around the franchise. Certainly 90% of it isn't worth your time, but I've read many a fanfic from the early 2000s that had a much better grasp on the characters and the ideas and everything about Sailor Moon than Sailor Moon Crystal does. Anyway, I just want to end this with a comparison of the end theme from Season 3 and the OP from Revolutionary Girl Utena, because Taguchi was so willing to exercise everything Ikahara did for the show from the Deathbusters arc, and then they used this for the ending. I couldn't believe it. Whatever.